The words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 53. Or do you think that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels? You may be seated.
How about that? Is that better? There you are. If you're visiting with us, let me say that we are glad to have you here with us, and hopefully at the beginning of our service you got one of those little packages of things, and inside that was an attendance card. If you have that attendance card, if you'll pass those toward the aisles, I've got some gentlemen who will come through and pick those up. We'd like to have a record of your attendance. 167 hours from now, we'll start our Friends and Family Day. That is next Sunday. By the way, if you're here visiting with us and no one has invited you, let me be the one to invite you, and you can come sit with me. We'll have to get a bigger pew, but that's all right. Come back next week. We have a Friends and Family Day. That will begin at 9 for Bible class, 10:15 as it normally does for our worship service. Then we'll have a meal together, and we'll have a evening service at 1:30. I told our class this morning, if you thought, man, that 1:30 service was great, I'm going to come back at 6. Next week, if you come back at 6, you're going to be alone. Our only evening worship service next week will be at 1:30. We hope that you will be a part of that. And for all those out there who may not have heard of that, this is your invitation from us. Come to Hot Springs next week and be a part of this. We would love to be able to have you and love to be able for you to be a part of this, and that give us an opportunity to host you. 10,000 Angels, the song we just sang, I guess. If I have to admit it, we have sung that song, as far as I know, in my lifetime, I guess, a million times. It's a great song. I love the song. Glad to sing it. But it's one that should be very familiar to us. Last week when we were studying about Jesus Christ, we studied about that last prayer he had. You remember in the back corner of that garden, where he could watch those people come across in Matthew 26, 36 through 46. He could see the people as they left the temple, those who were going to, coming to arrest him. We could see him in that garden with those three friends, and how he needed those three friends, and how those three friends needed to be there. And we looked a great deal at the humanity of Jesus Christ. You know, when he prays that prayer of, I don't want to do this. That's a very telling thing that he prayed. We looked at the word nevertheless a lot. Imagine, if you could, being in the back of that garden and then walking down the valley to the nearest main gate, which would be a diagonal walk across the city from the house of the high priest. That's where they took him first. And so we're there last year, and we're walking that walk that would more than likely have been the walk. And we make it to the high priest house after a little snafu. We walked a little further than we should, but that was all right. I think it was 15, ended up being about 15 miles that day. By the way, if you ever go to Jerusalem and walk, please get really good shoes before you go, because you will wear them out. We make it to this high priest's house, the one. This is the one that the high priest lived in. This is the one. It has underneath the house, it has a cell, has a holding cell. It's somewhere around 12, 15 feet deep. It's cut into the ground. And it's probably about 10 feet circular. And you can stack about 30 people in there if you love each other and get real close. And it was in this particular cell, this one, where Jesus would be held. I don't know if I walked anywhere that Jesus did on that trip, but I know one place I was that he was. in this place that's small and confining, you stay in there long enough, it starts to shrink in a little bit on you. It's dark, it's not lit, there's no light, no candle, no nothing. I can imagine with only one person, it would be a very lonely place to be. I had the opportunity during that trip to lead a few songs. You'd go these certain places, you would sing those songs. 10,000 Angels was in this cell. Sounds really, really good if you can get past the sound of this, as people will wipe their running noses and wipe the tears out of their eyes as you sing that song. It's a very interesting place to sing that song, because you're at the last leg of the journey of Jesus the Christ here. He's within 36 hours of being nailed to a cross here. He's in the bottom of this cell, has already come to terms in the garden with what's going to happen, and here he is, watching that clock go tick, 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 until man's clock meets up with God's time. And they'll take him from that cell, and the parade will begin. If you have a red book near you or in your lap, the one that we just sang from, if you'd like an outline of the sermon, you'll have it there on page number 349. We're going to look at verse 1, verse 2, verse 3, verse 4, and the chorus. Verse 1. Most of verse 1 we know and probably can repeat. We know it as the story of the crucifixion and how he gets from that garden to the place where they're going to crucify him. They find him in that garden, they bind him hand, and they drag him across the place there, and they bring him to this holding cell. At the point in time, they slap him, they tear out the hairs of his beard. But there's one phrase in verse 1 that has caught my attention. And it's at the very last of verse 1. What they said he's to blame. Said it's his fault. The sinless one, the one who has no sin from eternity. The one who has no sin, who kept God's law perfectly. That's the one they said is your fault. Out of all the things Jesus may or may not have on this earth, fault ain't one of them. He has no fault. They said it's your fault that you would come and preach that we're not following God properly. Well, you're not. The fact of the matter is they had gotten used to a version of following after God that didn't meet the standard. They'd gotten used to a version of following after God that was more tradition than it was doctrine. They've gotten used to weighing out all of their spices and all of these things and then passing by a man who's beat half to death so they don't have to touch him or look at him. They've gotten used to being servants of Judaism more than servants of God. Was that Jesus' fault? They said, we don't like you. Well, I guess if we don't like people, we can just kill them. I hope not. You know anybody you don't like? Better yet, you know anybody who doesn't like you? Well, he wasn't to blame. We don't like you because you're telling us negative things about ourselves that we need to change. He eats food with the dregs of humanity, with prostitutes, with lepers, with Samaritans. He treats them like they're just regular people. And for that, he needs to be crucified. He's to blame? For what? For treating people like people? For presenting to people who probably have never been presented before a little bit of human decency to people who are made in the very image of God? What's he at fault for? Well, he has compassion on the Gentile and on the leper. There's an account in the book of Matthew. One single leper comes to Jesus. This is before miracle after miracle after miracle begins. This is one of the earlier ones. This wasn't the first one, but it's one of the earlier ones. This one leper comes to Jesus, and he says, if you'll cleanse me, I'll be clean. To which Jesus, interestingly, Matthew wrote, had compassion on him. Notice this, and touched him. Just a touch. We don't think much about it. We shake hands every day. We talk to people. We hug people. It's just touch is what we do, except this man has a very communicable disease. It's in so much that the law would say, don't touch him. You would be at fault for getting it yourself. Jesus, the source of light and the source of healing, reaches his hand out and touches this man. How? I don't know. But here's what I do know. This might be the only time in years, if not decades, that this man has felt the warmth of a human hand. And Jesus is to blame for that. Verse 1. All of the things that happen to you is because it's your fault. Where's the blame? What kind of blame would fall onto a man who's following God and telling people to follow God the proper way, who only has compassion toward people, who shows compassion toward those that society won't, who looks at the sick and the Gentile and says, we're all realistically of one blood. Notice verse 2. Verse 2, we look at everything that's mentioned there, and we pretty well know that particular aspect of this story. And then there's this phrase, all alone he suffered everything. I don't guess I realized until this week. I know he's put on that cross. I know he's put there by himself. I know on either side he has some criminals there. I know as he's on trial, he's there by himself. I know while he's being beaten, he's there by himself. I know while he's in that holding cell, he's there by himself. It really never dawned on me how alone he would probably be. Here's the one who has no sin committed of himself, has zero sin, and he has the guilt of the sin of humanity laid upon his shoulders. He becomes the sacrifice. He has not committed one of those, but yet to his account, all of those are placed there. Can you imagine how lonely of a feeling it must be if you are a child to have to bear the punishment of your brother and sister? Wonder what it feels like as the Son of God, the one who is pre-existent, the one from eternity, who has to bear the sin of the human race. And no one else can help him carry it. It all falls on his shoulders. John chapter 12, verse 33, Jesus would say there, "And I, if I be lifted up, will draw all men unto me." If you look at that statement, he's speaking into a foretelling of what's going to happen to him, obviously, with being drawn up. But he's suspended there. He's suspended between people who need him but don't want him, and between a father who, in order to save man, can't help him. He is alone for the first time in his life, all alone. And that must have been a lonely time. Notice verse 3. We've looked at those particular aspects of verse 3, and we notice those things. And then there's this last phrase: the sinful work of man was done. They've been thinking for a while, not just right here on this hill outside of Jerusalem. They've been thinking for a while, how can we kill this guy? How can we get rid of this guy? How can we put him out of our worry and concern? How can we go on living the life that we have already lived? Because that's where we want to be anyway. They were sick and tired of being sick and tired of hearing this guy talk to them about how much they were doing wrong. Notice that. They were tired of hearing that, yet they were unwilling to just change. And the points that he were making about them not doing it the way God would have, they are perfectly just. And their idea is, if we get rid of the tattletale, then we'll get rid of having to hear what he has to say. Let's follow that logic for just a moment. Suppose that is true. Suppose you get rid of him, you get rid of having to hear his message. Okay. Does it make it any less true? Because the truth of the statement is, as my mother would say, going to stand when the world's on fire. That's just where it is. What they think is, if we'll kill him, everything in our life will go back to normal. What a great idea. When you kill him, you start the clock. Because in 50 days from this death, the entirety of God's plan to man is going to be fulfilled and changed. Your normal no longer exists. Y'all remember what it was like before COVID? Somebody shake or nod. That normal no longer exists. How many of you have allergies? Do you dare at this time of year to cough in public? People will look at you like you are insane. It's just allergies. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Their normal will change, and it will never go back. It cannot go back. It is literally following the very plan of God that God has given them more than 4,000 years ago, and they refuse to see it. And their plan, outside of the city walls of Jerusalem, according to Hebrews chapter 13, verse number 17, is that we kill him. They weren't looking for the redemptive plan of God to come through. They weren't looking for the church to be established 50 days from then. They weren't looking for the Messiah to walk out of that tomb on that Sunday morning. What they were looking for is that sinful work to be done and Him to be in the grave and them to be past it. Verse 3. How about verse 4? At the same time in which man's sinful work is being done, at the exact same time, God's plan of salvation is being completed. At the exact same time. How is that possible? Well, that's a question for a bigger pay grade than mine. Here's what you do. Write that down. Put it in the coat pocket of whatever suit you want to be buried in. And when you get there, take it out and say, how'd that happen? The answer is, ladies and gentlemen, I have no idea. But it is at the same time in which the diabolical man was working his plan to get rid of the loudmouth, that the salvation plan of God was being met in order to have the sacrifice. And not just any sacrifice. If you go back to Exodus chapter 12, we are on the day of Jesus' death here. We are in Passover. So you find that first in Exodus chapter 12. If you'll make it over there, you'll find out all of those specifications for this Passover lamb. There's a split of all the lamb herds in the world when God first says it has to be male. We've cut half of the lambs of the world out. It cannot be female. Then we look at it, it has to be a year, right at a year old, okay? Well, it cuts out those that are much younger and those that are over a year, doesn't it? God also says about this lamb, it has to be one that has not had any sort of damage, no spot, no blemish, no abnormalities as it's born. It has to be, we would look at it and go, that's the perfect lamb. That cuts out a lot of other things. In the same fashion, this sacrifice that was made on that cross couldn't just be anybody. Has to be fulfilled God's way. It can't, look here, it can't be me. Even if I'm standing at the cross on the time that God would allow for the salvation of man and the blood to be shed, it can't be me. As if I am on that cross, then I am on that cross because of something I did. And for me to pay the stake because of something I did, it just makes a square. It doesn't redeem anyone, does it? And here's a man who has no sin in his life to redeem all of humanity. Turn over in your Bibles, if you will, to Hebrews chapter 9, beginning in verse number 22. I want you to read something about this sacrifice. Hebrews chapter 9, verse number 22. Almost all things are by the law purged with blood, and without the shedding of blood is no remission. It was therefore necessary that the patterns of things in heaven should be purified with these. But the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifice than these, for Christ is not entered into the holy place made with hands, which are the figures of now true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us, nor yet that He should offer Himself often, as the high priest entereth into the holy place every year with the blood for others. For He then must often have suffered since the foundation of the world, but now once in the end of the world hath He appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of Himself. And as it is appointed unto man once to die, but after this the offering, so Christ was once delivered to bear the sins of many, and unto them that look for Him He shall appear a second time without sin unto salvation. Notice what's being said here. If the Old Testament pattern was followed to a very T, then it would be Jesus having to get back on that cross every single year. That's not the kind of sacrifice it is. It's not just an animal sacrifice. This is the sacrifice sanctified by Jesus or by God Himself in that plan that says, this is what will fix it. This is what will redeem them. This is what I've been looking for. And after this, there is no more need of salvation. The last two verses we are familiar with. And as it is appointed a man once to die, then after this, the judgment. Verse 27. If you'll read verse 28, what you'll read is, Jesus the Christ, when He returns that second time, is not going to return as a sacrifice. He's not going to return as the point of salvation. He's going to return as the judge. Now, since He's left, am I ready to see that judge? Well, let's look at the chorus. Notice what the chorus says. He could have called 10,000 angels. And I think that's a poetic license for Matthew chapter 26, verse number 53, where he says, I could have called 12 legions of angels. In 2 Kings chapter 19, verse number 35, there's an interesting battle that's going on. Sennacherib, that's a good name if anybody's looking for a name. Sennacherib is outside of the walls of Jerusalem. He's getting ready to go in the morning and just wipe everybody out. Okay? He and his army, his Assyrian army, are on the hills there, and they are taking a nap before they go in, and they're going to destroy the city. Then comes along this one fella, sent by God, known to us as the term angel. And in the army of the Assyrians, there are 185,000 soldiers. By the way, that's a lot. Sennacherib and all these guys go to sleep, never to wake up. I think it's 2 Kings 19, 35 or 36. If you read in the King James Version, it's very humorous, as it would say. And when the Israelites woke up, they all woke up dead. I don't know how you wake up dead. It's an interesting idea. The reality is, when the Israelites woke up, all of the Assyrians on the hill were dead. So, let's take into account that one angel can kill 185,000 people. Okay? Keep that right there in your head. Let's just say that's the maximum they can do. When Jesus speaks of these 12 legions of angels, we have to begin to sort of dissect what a legion is in the Roman army. That's somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 soldiers, just depending. They're generally from a certain area. And so if you had 5,050, that's going to be all right. They're not going to take those 50 and say, no, we have to put you somewhere else. Generally, it's the same people from the same area. So it's generally 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers. So then that would mean that that the legions would be, 12 legions would be somewhere between 60,000 angels and 72,000 angels, if we just use that easy math. Are you ready? Which means on the low end, 60,000 angels could kill 11.1 billion people. On the high end, they could kill 13.32 billion people. What's Jesus saying? If I wanted to stop this, you cannot contain what I would bring on this earth. I could have called 12 legions of angels. Now that statement right there, the thrust of that statement is the word could have, or the phrase could have. This is what I could have done. I could have stopped this. I could have said, I'm not going through with it. I could have said, you can be lost for eternity because I'm not going through the rest of this. But I did not. I could have destroyed the entirety of the world. But instead of killing the entirety of the world, I've made a way to save it. We often, back home, say, somebody should have done this or would have done this and could have done that, to which we will answer, shoulda, woulda, coulda. You know, you should have done, well, you should have. This is a whole lot of things post what could have been done that you were saying you could have done. Jesus wasn't obligated to die. If he was, he never makes the statement, I choose to lay my life down. I choose to pick it back up again, John 10, verse 18. But in understanding that he doesn't have to, he's not obligated to die, you don't demean the fact that he chose. He chose to die in order to redeem us back to God. Because without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin. And without the proper sacrifice, you and I are never bought back to God. Without that sacrifice, we stand guilty of our sin. We stand before God who will judge us, and Him to say, what do you have to say for yourself? Only for us to answer, there's nothing I can say. With that sacrifice, Jesus the Christ has changed the dimensions a little bit. We now still stand before a God who will judge us and say, what do you have to say for yourself? But now we have the opportunity to say this, Jesus the Christ. We say, well, that doesn't make a whole lot of difference. Oh, it makes a lot of difference. It's the only difference. It's the only difference that will be made in eternity. It's the only thing that will matter when God says, what do you have to say for yourself? And it's the only thing that's going to redeem me back to God, save me and buy me back from where I was to where God wants me to be. And it doesn't happen through hearing. It doesn't happen through belief only or repentance only or confession only or baptism only. It doesn't happen that way. But when you put those things together, hearing God's plan, Romans 10:17, and believing it, John 8, verse 24, repenting of my sin, Luke 13, 3 and 5, confessing that Jesus is the Christ, Matthew 10, 32 and 33, and then being baptized in water for the remission of my sins, Acts 2, verse 38, also the entire book of Acts, Romans chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, and we can keep on going. That's what buys man back into God's household, according to God's plan. Then he says, there's only really one more thing you have to do, and we think, well, that's great. What is that? He said, I just want you to live faithfully. That's a lot. That means I wake up in the morning and I say, as my feet hit the ground, whatever God says for me to do today, that's what I'm going to do. However God has commanded me to live, that's how I'm going to live, whether anybody likes it or not. Whether 8 billion people on the world aside from me turn their backs from God and I'm the only one, I'm still obligated to do it. I'm still His child and I still want to be faithful. A couple of questions for you this morning. One, have you put on Christ in baptism? If not, that's the place to start. You know, when you begin to play Monopoly and everybody starts at that square that says start, that's where you are. You're beginning to take the pieces out of the box and put it on the start square. That's where you start. You can't start halfway around and say, I want to start at Boardwalk and just buy that. You can't do that. That's not right. And once I start from there, as I play that Monopoly game, I play it within the rules, don't I? Hopefully. Wait a minute, how many of you cheat at Monopoly? Don't. Playing it within the rules means I'm faithful to what the rules say about that game. Would I not also be faithful to the rules of what God says about life? If I'm His child, would I not also be faithful to Him as I live through this life? Would I not one day want to stand before Him and have Him say, my son, my daughter, welcome home. We've been waiting for you. Those are the things you want to hear? If that's the case, then you're going to have to be obedient to Him here and now. While you have space, while you have opportunity. If you've not been obedient, would you? If you've not been faithful, would you recommit your life to God? And do those things right now while we stand and sing for your encouragement.
There's